In part 1 of Footprints in the Wilderness,
stunned that they could take this kind of and death.
we started in René Goupil's Loire Valley birthplace, explored the church where he was baptized, and an ancient hospital in the heart of the royal city of Angers, where Goupil may have trained to become a barber surgeon. Paris, the city of light. René Goupil came here in 1639 from his home in the Loire Valley. He had decided to become a Jesuit. Notre Dame Cathedral, appearing much the same as when he walked up to it, entering perhaps through the left portal, where, carved in stone overhead, St.René, the first bishop of Paris and one of the patron saints of France, holds his own head, severed by a Roman sword in the 3rd century. St.René is said to have picked up his own head and walked on, some believe continuing to preach the word of Christ, before finally collapsing. Jesuit Father Bernard Gilibert, an expert in the church history of his native Paris, believes that this strange and wondrous story expresses a Christian ideal central to René Goupil and the French martyrs of North America, that Christ triumphed, not in battle, but in death. Father retraces the steps of the stricken saint up this hill, called Montmartre, Mount of the Martyrs, site of the famous Basilica of the Sacred Heart.
La vue sur Paris n'est pas belle. Vous croyez pas? Non, parce qu'elle est toute, c'est plat. C'est pas ce qu'il y a de beau à Paris.
But this immense and famous structure is not where he is taking us today.
Ça, c'est le chevet de Saint-Pierre.
Behind and dwarfed by it is a much older, less celebrated church, but one much more important to our story. Leading us through this ancient church, constructed partly of stone taken from a Roman temple, Father explains where we are and why he has brought us here.
Voilà. Alors, nous sommes dans l'église Saint-Pierre de Montmartre.
We are in the Église Saint-Pierre, the Church of St. Peter in Montmartre. It was here on the 15th of August, 1534, that Ignatius of Loyola retrieved the keys to a nearby crypt, where he had found, with 6 other students of the University of Paris, the order that René Goupil had decided to join. The Jesuits started here. Was it French Catholicism's tradition of martyrdom that inspired Jesuits René Goupil, Jean de Brébeuf, Isaac Jogues, and their companions to sail off to the wilds of Canada and sacrifice their lives? Surprisingly, Father thinks not. You asked me why young Frenchmen were drawn to the Canadian missions, and to martyrdom in particular, and you alluded to the example set by Saint-René and the other early martyrs of France. But no, it is not necessary to search so far back. The Jesuits and their missions were a response to something much more immediate. The Jesuits were founded only 17 years after Martin Luther nailed up his 95 Theses in Wittenberg, Germany. The Church, already reeling from years of ineffective leadership, was now struck with a full-blown revolution. Religious unrest quickly spread to France.
Ce que je voulais signifier, c'est que l'ambiance de Paris n'était pas une ambiance calme.
The atmosphere in Paris at that time was anything but calm. Only 3 months after the founding of the Jesuits, this great inspirational event, 30 Protestants were burned alive in the Latin Quarter for purely religious reasons. I think it's important to understand that.
Des raisons purement religieuses. Voilà. Je crois que c'est important de comprendre ça.
For the next 70 years, France was gripped by sporadic outbreaks of violence. Both Protestants and Catholics were victims of atrocities. England took advantage of the strife and backed Protestant forces against the Catholic crown. In 1572, Protestants were attacked in Paris in what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. By the end of the century, the many-headed dragon of religious violence was slain when King Henry IV granted religious freedom to Protestants in his famous Edict of Nantes. But peace was not to be had by fiat, and the dragon stalked well into the 17th century. But the passions that fed this demon in some were the source of great inspiration in others. Artists were turning away from the horrors of conflict with others to find God within themselves. Their inspiration, the Catholic Church. Father Gilibert.
Après le traumatisme de la Réforme, le pape Paul III, qui est un grand pape.
After the trauma of the Protestant Reformation, Pope Paul III, a great pope, takes matters into his own hands in assembling the most important deliberative body in the history of the Church, the Council of Trent. In addition to stabilizing the Church, the Council would have a far-reaching impact on artistic expression, sowing the seeds of what later came to be known as the Baroque movement.
Sur le plan de l'art, le baroque. Et le baroque, c'est l'explosion d'une église qui est enfin heureuse d'exister.
The Baroque. The explosive expression of a revitalized church. The canon promulgated at the Council of Trent insisted that art speak to the poor and the illiterate rather than only the well-to-do and the educated. Baroque artists turned consciously to the senses, employing a style that was direct, simple, obvious, and most of all, dramatic. The depth of emotion these artists strived for was described by a French word we've heard before, but it had a very special meaning in 16th century Europe. That word is mystique.
Alors, pour comprendre un mystique,
the word mystique in this particular context started in the 16th century. It meant that one does not see God up in the sky as they did during the Middle Ages. Rather, one searches for God in the deepest regions of oneself. This is what St. Teresa of Avila taught. It was this idea that drove Ignatius of Loyola, and the missionaries we're discussing here.
Nos premiers pères ici.
Perhaps no one figure of the Catholic Counter-Reformation better expressed this intense personal and emotional attachment to God than the Spanish sister Teresa of Avila, foundress of the Carmelite order. She was canonized just 40 years after her death in 1622, the same year that Ignatius of Loyola and Francis Xavier were made saints. In writings intended only for her sister Carmelites, Teresa set down the ways in which she had experienced God directly. In one famous passage, Teresa described the love of God as piercing her heart like a burning arrow. The pain and ecstasy of this dramatic moment are frozen in polished marble in this stunning work, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, in the Carnaro Chapel of Our Lady of Victory Church in Rome. While a transcendent light floods the scene from a hidden window above, an angel holds an arrow he has just withdrawn from Teresa. The work, by sculptor Giovanni Lorenzo Bernini, perhaps the most famous artist of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, disturbed many and rendered others speechless. But the saint's expression describes better than words can the meaning of mystique. Religious devotion and sectarian conflict. As the 16th century drew to a close, its strange alchemy threatened to engulf the 17th. And it might have, but for the intervention of one man, his name, Richelieu. In 1622, that same event-filled year that Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, and Teresa of Avila became saints, Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu was named cardinal and shortly became the closest advisor to the king. His goal, an end to factionalism and the consolidation of royal power, Although he personally conducted military campaigns against Protestant forces, Richelieu's interest was less in fighting religious wars than in defending the expansion of France into the New World. And he understood that if France were to resist the steady encroachments of the English into her new colonies, a strong, independent, well-fortified center must be established in the New World. And Richelieu did not hesitate to employ the religious zeal of the missionaries to that end. This, I believe, is the true origin of the Jesuit missions. And you begin to hear repeated the prophetic phrase. The blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians. From the record of his birth at Saint-Martin-du-Bois, there is not another written account of the life of René Goupil until he entered the Jesuit novitiate in the Latin Quarter of Paris on March 26, 1639.
When Goupil entered the society in Paris in 1639, he could read, he could write, which was very unusual for a brother at that time. In addition to that, he was a surgeon.
In Paris, Father Bro discovered that the novitiate was now gone. Even the streets today have different names. All he could do was sketch where it had been. From its founding in 1608 until its closure by royal decree 155 years later, the novitiate formed hundreds of priests and brothers, most of them bound for the Society's schools and missions throughout the world. Then, suddenly, darkness. In 1763, the college was closed by royal fiat. The Jesuits, who had become influential on the world stage, were losers in a political power struggle and were required to renounce their vows under pain of banishment. A year later, the king signed an edict dissolving the society throughout his dominions. The building sat empty for 25 years. On the Rue Mézières, in what is today a very different scene, Father Gilibert tells the final chapter of the story.
À des marchands de biens qui ont détruit dans les années 1800 l'église et les bâtiments et qui ont.
By the early 1800s, the church and the buildings had all been torn down following the French Revolution.
Évidemment, c'est un crime, mais peut-être que
it was a crime and probably would never have happened if the Jesuits had continued to reside on the premises. A great institution of learning was replaced by the buildings you see here today in what was essentially a financial operation.
C'est une opération financière. Voilà.
Wandering further into the neighborhood, Father nevertheless finds a symbol of what once was.
Que toute cette partie que vous voyez avec ces balcons.
The facade you see here with its iron balconies may be part of the original buildings of the novitiate.
Vierge qui a été mise
The
ici.
statue of the Virgin you see here is probably not from that era, but it nevertheless evokes the fact that this was once a religious site, the place where the Jesuit novices were instructed, and retreats held throughout the 17th and 18th centuries.
La maison de retraite où l'on donnait les exercices au XVIIe, au XVIIIe siècle.
In entering the novitiate, Goupil had set his sights not on becoming a Jesuit priest, but a coadjutor brother, meaning one who helps another. He was taught that Jesuit spirituality is based on the belief that the world was created as a gift, to be used in such a way as to enable one to experience God in this world. The typical novice might have had difficulty finding God in the world as it existed just beyond the gates of the novitiate. Here, the Latin Quarter, near the University of Paris, was populated in Goupil's time much as it is today, by restless young people from all over the globe who wandered its narrow streets, searching for stimulation, companionship, or distraction.
When Goupil left the novitiate, he entered a world which was quite different. Not exactly an environment to foster the kind of experience the Jesuits were teaching. And I wonder if he didn't just kind of think, I'd like to be in a forest. Maybe there would be red men, savages, but at least there wouldn't be corruption.
It is difficult to overestimate the hold Canada had on the French imagination during the 17th century. French missionaries had been in Canada since 1610, a decade before the Pilgrims landed in America. In long and detailed reports, they told of the need for schools for Native American boys and girls, and of the pressing need for a hospital. Rumors circulated of a planned voyage of colonists and missionaries to Quebec in 1639, the year René Goupil was at the novitiate. This risky undertaking involved even female missionaries, the Ursuline and Augustine sisters, who would become the first women in history to go as missionaries to a foreign land. Walking out from the novitiate in Paris, the first thing René Goupil would have seen was the imposing Église Saint-Sulpice, where Vincent de Paul, founder of the Sisters of Charity, often preached. Canada was on de Paul's mind, as men and women bound for her shores came to him for advice. It was on the mind of the Jesuit provincial, who had to choose missionaries for a dangerous undertaking, one possibly involving the loss of life. New France was in the air and on the mind of everyone. Like many of those gathering in Dieppe for the voyage, the 31-year-old Goupil may never have seen an ocean before he set sail for the New World. The missionaries could only guess what waited for them beyond the safety of the breakwater. One sister wrote, "We must leave France without delay to go to the New World, where God is almost unknown. It is at this point I bid you farewell, since the vessels are ready, and we shall embark next week unless a storm delays us." But a storm did delay them. Remaining within the relative safety of the breakwater, they waited 3 days. The great work they were to do in New France held up now by this sudden threat, one they were certain that Satan himself had conjured up. The second day they watched in horror as the wind snapped the mooring of a sister vessel and flung it against the rocks with the loss of all on board. Even so, the missionary chaplain of the expedition Goupil would join the very next year assures us that the missionaries gathering in Dieppe for the voyage, quote, mocked at death and its approaches.
They mocked at death and its approaches when they were on dry land. They weren't out in the sea, not yet. I doubt if Goupil did much mocking at the approach of death or in the face of the ocean, because death was not an abstract or theoretical thing for him. He's a barber surgeon. He had to deal with death. He had the kind of a job even on a ship where perhaps people were afraid. They didn't want to get too close to you, stayed away from you. An uneasy kind of profession.
Wherever the determination to go to New France took hold of his imagination, René Goupil was not to begin his journey as a Jesuit. He had signed on board as a free laborer. This was no doubt because several months earlier he had been dismissed from the Jesuit novitiate.
Pour comprendre René Goupil et son départ, il faut le
In order to understand René Goupil at the moment of his departure for the New World, we reflect on what a donné, a volunteer, really was. For him, this meant giving himself totally to God. This is where the expression comes from. But this surgeon, who gives himself to God in order to work for the betterment of the Huron and perhaps even the Iroquois, was about to undergo a profound transformation. Little by little, from a surgeon, he would be transformed into a missionary.
Parce que petit à petit, de chirurgien, on va le voir évangélisateur.
Evangelical work souls to be won for Christ in a remote land. That prospect must have shone like a beacon through the chaos of 17th century Paris. Then, suddenly, the light went out, dismissed by those he longed to serve.
And he's dismissed at 31 years of age. You wonder what he felt like, what kind of a reaction he had when he was told to leave. His talent wasn't needed.